So what is this all about? So as you know, I throughout this experience of since we've opened Dr. David MD, I've been trying to come up with different ways to reach out to audiences to be able to fulfill the needs of the community. And of course, by doing the Ask Dr. David, which is something that I get to record and I make some pre-notes for. But I figured let's try some. We decided let's do something a little different here. Let's do something a little bit more of a live situation. As somebody who is a as an artist myself, as you know, in in the musical arts, the concept of improvisation, of being able to to do things on the go. I did print out some of the questions that I'm going to answer that came in the last 24 hours. I chose not to ponder. There was one question which we'll get to where I actually had no idea what the person was talking about, so I needed to do a little research to at least come up with a somewhat coherent answer. But here we go. But as we go along, of course, please put any questions that you have, and our off-camera producer Kevin will forward them to me, and we'll be able to go from there. Okay, so our first question from JD, and so I will be looking down at my papers a little more to answer these, to ask these questions. I've heard that you've had success with brain detoxification for children with extreme speech delays. My grandson, one of your patients, practices patients, is 5 years old and is currently receiving speech therapy. Threefold question: what is the criteria for accepting children into the program? Upon initial assessment, what are you usually able to determine whether said treatment will produce measurable results? And is brain detox covered by most insurance, or does one have to be out of pocket? Okay, so there's a lot to unwrap there. So first of all, I wouldn't say that I ever actually created a specific brain detoxification program. What we do very much is on body detoxification, which the brain is part of. But certainly, how does anybody short of doing brain biopsies or a spinal tap know what the level of toxicity is in the brain in the first place, let alone know whether you got it out? And so that's a challenge in and of itself, just to start off with, is the how do we actually know what we are accomplishing there on the tissue level? Now, one of the things that that I kind of say I'd put this into two different areas. Number one, people have heard about what I do with heavy metals, mercury and lead. Okay, now again, short of doing a sample biopsy, if I test metals are in the body, which I'll talk about more in a second, I can't tell where it's coming from. Okay, but I also know that heavy metals such as mercury and lead have a draw to neurological tissue. It's the affinity for those metals to go towards brain tissue is stronger than other parts of the body, which is why when you hear about mercury toxicity, lead toxicity, although it impacts the liver, you hear about cognitive development, you hear about developmental delays. And so, any metals in the body that we are able to eliminate, if the body's not eliminating on its own, is certainly a good thing, because if the metal is in the toilet, it's no longer able to get to the brain. Okay. Now, the specific way that I check for heavy metals is what's called a single dose chelation challenge test. Now, this is not the first thing that we go do. We want to make sure that people have good mineral levels ahead of time. We want to make sure that yeast has been taken care of. The chelating agent that we most commonly use, which is called DMSA, if you give that to somebody who has yeast, the likelihood that you're going to have a side effect, a bad outcome, is rather high. The yeast actually eats the DMSA, making the yeast stronger. And we do. I'm going through with one of the patient right now, where where we are seeing that there is like this flaring of yeast that can happen. And so when we talk about detoxification, also from a yeast perspective, from a healthy gut microbiome, one of the urine tests that we do, called an organic acid test, or as we affectionately call it, the oat test from Great Plains Laboratory. And there are 9 substances made by yeast, as well as 5 substances made by pathological bacteria, that are not made by human. And if a person pees in a cup and they find those toxins, then it's a pretty strong indicator that the yeast inside of us, since most human beings are not also mixed and breeded as part of yeast as well. So that's not part of our genetic code. So that's another way of us looking for it. So we also do stool cultures and testing, where we look under the microscope for the yeast, where they actually let it grow in the petri dish for a while. And so we do want to first get rid of yeast, which a detoxification in and of itself, of which I have seen spectacular improvements in many children. and adults who have had yeast and we got rid of it. In fact, if you were to ask me what is the single most beneficial thing I've seen over the 25 years of being a holistic pediatrician, I would say it's antifungal therapy. And as you know, many of you know, while I don't use a lot of pharmaceutical ingredients, prescription of pharmaceuticals like fluconazole, terbinafine, which is called Lamisil, I use a lot of it. And in fact, I would be interested to know if there's any other physician in the state of Florida who's actually written for more of that particular type of treatment than I have in the past 20 years. The reason why I haven't found success is I haven't found much success with herbal types of products. Certain diets can help. There are foods that feed yeast, a lot of sugary types of foods that increase inflammation, foods that increase leaky gut, high histamine foods for sensitive people. So, besides people taking antifungal treatments, we use probiotics and cultured foods. And we want to make sure that we can keep the yeast away, and that's where dietary control comes into play too. But as part of that detoxion, that's what helps us do successful heavy metal detoxification. So what we do, and another one of the treatments that we use is called EDTA, calcium disodium EDTA, is we collect the urine beforehand. This stands as a baseline. We give a one-time dose of chelation, and then we collect urine afterwards. And we compare those two urines. And if we see a bunch of metal the day after that wasn't there the day before, and assuming that the kid didn't eat a shark sandwich, and you see metal, or obviously if they didn't, eat lead, and you see a bump, the next day, then it tells us several really important pieces of information. Number one, if it's in the pee, that means it was in your body, right? And so you know right away that it was there. And if it wasn't there in the pre-urine and before we give the chelation, that tells you it wasn't coming out on its own, which is, of course, if a person's having detoxification problems, it might not be coming out on its own. But if you can, but the other thing that shows, if you get that before, not after, yes, the treatment works for removing the metal because it's been eliminated from the body. And if we do see that phenomenon happen, then we use that same chelation treatment in cycles. Typically, we start off with 3 days on, and we take 11 days off for recuperation. We give minerals as replacement, as part of, as well as other supplements. But the chelation can pull out minerals as well as the heavy metals that we're trying to remove, and so we of course don't want to create a depleted state. And so we do these cycles on and off with replenishment, and I'll typically do that for like 4 cycles, and then I'll go back and do the one-time urine collection after a one-time dose, and we see where we're at. And what we should be doing is we should be seeing the amount excreted coming down. Now, I do find that in older kids, it's more likely to stay up and then come down a little further down the line. And so we may have to go back and do another 4 cycles, or sometimes I'll do 6 cycles instead of 4 if I didn't make much change. Sometimes I'll go to maybe instead of 3 on and 11 off, I'll then move it up to 4 on and 10 off. I've gotten, even for some very toxic people, even 3 days on and 4 days off. Of course, more supportive minerals, etc., since it's more intense, etc. And then when we do that urine collection, we also do safety blood tests. We do a liver and kidney profile. We do a CBC blood count. We make sure that none of those minerals, we actually do a mineral analysis to make sure that we were keeping up with what we were doing. And all of those things need to be cool before we go ahead into the next round in the next cycles. And of course, we just keep on following until we get the numbers down. I'll typically want to repeat that about 6 months later once we get the numbers normal, just to make sure nothing's come back. But I also recognize if something came back, or if the metals didn't come down in the first place, that would indicate to me that there's probably an ongoing exposure happening, of which then we start looking at the environment. We start looking at, what the playgrounds, what's in the house. I've found lead and mercury in some very interesting places, and especially lead, where I have found it in like the tire mulch that kids have played in, like that's on a playground. I had one child. There was a family heirloom that was a lead crystal chalice sent down through generations. I never thought about it, but as the numbers weren't coming down, this mom said, "You don't think this could have anything to do with the lead chalice that he likes to drink it?" And I'm like, the lead crystal chalice, not the lead chalice, lead crystal. And I'm like, I never really thought about it, but I guess that's why they call it lead crystals, because there's lead in there. And the family's like, well, that's it, we're done with that. And they actually said that they went home and into the fireplace, like the old smashing of the champagne glass into the fireplace. Sure enough, the next time we checked, the numbers massively came down. Another family, we found it in the pottery. They had some Mexican pottery that they were storing their rice in, and it turns out that the ceramic and the paint had it in there. We even found it once in the lining of a bathtub. It was an older bathtub. There were some scrapes in the enamel, and it was actually lead inside of it. So whenever this kid took a bath, and we were doing Epsom salt baths, because as many of you know, we use Epsom salts, the magnesium sulfate. The sulfate is also a detoxifying agent. And here we were thinking that we were helping somebody out, and then all of a sudden we did like, no, we were actually increasing this kid's toxin all along. And then again, once they remedied that situation, the number came down too. So again, we want to look to see where those environments are. Now, there's also a deeper question here, which is, why is this particular person accumulating metal while another person may not be? Obviously, if they were exposed to mercury thermometers, you know, coincidence or not, I now see more lead than mercury. As many of you know, and before many children nowadays were born, but up until, when was it? I guess it was the early 2000s, when the mercury was pulled out of the vaccines. Coincidence or not, I can only report what I'm observed. But when that happened and they took the mercury out of the vaccines, that's when I started seeing the frequency of mercury in the heavy metal in the kids' urines when we do the chelation come down. So obviously that's not a proof of cause. Obviously they took the mercury out because even though they claimed it's not a problem, obviously somebody thought it was a problem, or at least society thought it was a problem, saying, why the heck do you have mercury in there? It's a single dose vaccine. You don't. I mean, it was a multi-dose vaccine. You could just put single doses in there, and then you don't need to put the mercury in because it was being done as a preservative. Right? But we were injecting mercury into kids. Now we know about the heavy metals in fish. And the bigger the fish that have eaten, the smaller the fish that have eaten, the smaller fish, the biggest fish have the most mercury in them. So the shark and the swordfish and the, marlins like that, sometimes the grouper here in Florida, especially in the West Coast. I know that grouper's a thing, but that could be a bigger one as well. But, there's that potential exposure. And of course, even with my preconception to infancy project, wanting to get these cleared out before a woman could even conceive is something that we aim for as well. So there are those things that we do to want to try not just detoxify, but stop the toxic buildup happening in the first place. Now, the other part of that is what is actually happening with a person's own detoxification system. Now, one of the most important detoxifiers that we naturally make is called glutathione, reduced glutathione. If you've been in my practice, a patient of mine, you've probably heard me mumble those words if you're not on it already, your kid's not on it already. But glutathione, it's something we naturally make. It's something we make from cysteine or NAC N-acetylcysteine, which also people can be low in, and also something we can give to somebody. So we can give the glutathione, we can give cysteine to people, but that goes to a bigger picture. And again, I know some of you heard me talk about this, called the methylation transulfation pathway. And of course, if you've hung out with me long enough, you've heard about MTHFR, which is methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase. My father was the first person who I discovered on this, who said, I have the motherfucker what at it. And certainly, if you've looked at those letters, you'll know what I'm talking about. But this is a gene mutation that decreases the ability of the body to take folate and activate it to what's called methylfolate. And this reaction is the first step of this multi-step pathway. Methylfolate is then needed to activate B12 to methyl B12. There's a whole bunch of other reactions that eventually get to the production of the cysteine and the glutathione. And so so we kind of think of like a dominoes falling, and no matter which domino is broken, you may not get to the final at the end. So we now do these methylation genetic tests. You've heard the Max Gen profile that we do possibly. And this is how we are able to then see which dominoes are broken, and then we can kind of reach over to flick the next one. So if you can't take folate and turn it into methylfolate, take methylfolate. If you can't take B12, turn it into methyl B12 because you genetically can't. Take methyl B12. So that's a more comprehensive, so again, kind of coming back to the, not to mislead somebody to think that we actually have a brain detoxification program, but we do have a pretty comprehensive detoxification program, especially when it comes to heavy metals and other types of toxins as well. And of course, all the avoidance of the pesticides, molds, mycotoxins, identifying again other forms of toxins, identifying molds. If mycotoxins are present, where is the child being exposed to? Chemicals that they're being exposed to. I recall very distinctly earlier in my career where this child, when he became a teenager, started having seizures every other Monday, like clockwork. And after the fourth, and I was talking to the mom, I'm like, there's got to be an exposure. There's something. Is there anything that happens differently on Monday or over the weekend? She's like, no. Then she actually checked in with the school, and every other weekend they would do this deep cleaning with these extra chemicals at the school and in his classroom. And so I'm like, well, maybe that's it. And sure enough, so they stopped it and the kid stopped having seizures. So being an investigator here, playing Sherlock Holmes to try to figure out where that exposure is and then supporting the detox system as much as possible. That's all part of our detoxification product. To answer those other questions though, so there is no criteria. Anybody who wishes to do that, and certainly if a person has special needs, that would certainly increase my feeling of, hey, something's not right here. Let's see if it's there. Um, you know, there's no, I can tell very early on if those toxins are present. And I can tell that they've been removed from the body. But would I sit in front of somebody and say, I only swear that your kid will start talking if this will happen? No. But incidentally, or not coincidentally, but at the Autism Research Institute, which, if you may have heard about Dan Doctors originally, which was Defeat Autism Now, which the name was changed after Dan got sued by the Divers Action Network because we were using hyperbarics, and somehow or another they thought that us treating kids with autism was going to be confused with people who do scuba diving, but we didn't feel like having a lawyer argue that. But also, people started realizing, are we really trying to defeat autism? Are we trying to defeat people with autism? And even people with autism were having, hey, I don't need to be defeated. I need to be supported. So there was a lot of reasons why that name was changed. But the Autism Research Institute, which is the parent organization, does an annual survey of different supplements and treatments, not just supplements, but all kinds of treatments, and they would rank it as helped, hurt a lot, hurt a little, no change, helped a little, helped a lot. And chelation therapy does consistently rank at the top of the list of things that are most helpful for people with children. So again, that's not a scientific study; it's a data gathering situation. But again, more information for you. Um, the chelating agents themselves typically are not, occasionally I've seen insurance pay for DMSA since it is by prescription. Um, Maybe 25% of the time I'll see that happen. So it can be, the safety tests that we do, looking at the liver, kidney, CBC, blood count, minerals, etc., zinc levels. That's something that insurances will cover. The urine tests of the metals themselves, as well as the red blood cell mineral analysis. That's something that people do have to pay out of pocket for. So hopefully that answered that question. Okay. Now from Pavrita. Do you have any plans on developing courses like reading blood labs from a functional perspective? So, and she has another question, but let me answer that. So, one of the things that we have as a long-term goal of Dr. David MD as part of our expanding health option and educational options is to be able to offer different types of seminars, both for families and patients, maybe even to be able to create medical units for practitioners. It's something that we have put on our books as something that is a goal for us to be doing once we kind of get bigger and more established and have more funding, or we can pull one of those things off. Obviously, it takes a lot of time to put that together, but certainly do that. But of course, as I, on a case by case basis, of course, I'm educating people all the time on what these values mean and how we treat them. Second question: is it okay for a kid to be on iron maintenance dose for a long time? Absolutely. Okay. Obviously, if they were getting it from their diet because they were a meat eater or they were eating vegetarian products that were high in iron, they'd be getting a maintenance dose from that. So if they're not getting it from the diet, then we move to a supplement to make it the difference. So the most important thing, and the reason why I check everybody's iron levels, their ferritin levels, their iron binding capacity levels, so I have an understanding of, does this person have a deficiency of iron in the first place. A person may not, of course, if a person's anemic, one of the reasons is an iron deficiency. B12 deficiency can cause it, folate deficiency, hemorrhage can cause it, sickle cell anemia, anemia of chronic illness. There could be anemias of pregnancy, all types of things that can happen. Of course, people who take chemo or have other bone marrow suppressing agents, etc., can have that as well. But the most important thing is to test and to follow up test and make sure that you're hitting the mark. But if you have somebody in a good, healthy range, then we're really not doing anything. I mean, at the end of the day, these are micro pebbles. So at the end of the day, the most important thing is that a person has this really important mineral in their body for them to do the functions, because it's not just for anemia, cognitive function, the immune system. There are other parts of the body that iron plays an important role in as well. Okay, thank you for that question. Okay, now this next question is from George. Do you have any research on the safety for boys taking melatonin to help with sleep issues long term, especially with the effects on the hormones in puberty? What amount would be considered safe to give to a teen that struggles with sleep due to beginning of spectrum? Now, there have been short-term studies that have looked at this. I am not aware, and I actually did a little bit of searching because when I saw this question earlier today, I was not able to find any long-term studies about that. So it's a very fair question. Now, I also look at melatonin, though, because it's a hormone, as really something that's only going to help you sleep if your body's not making enough, not hitting the receptors enough in the first place. Okay. So I'm really looking at this as a replacement therapy. And similar to if a person with a similar sounding insulin, melatonin, their pancreas wasn't making enough insulin, is that person going to need to take it long term in order to fill that need? Yes. Okay. But at the end of the day, it's not something that I jump on first. There's so many questions that I have. There's this concept of sleep hygiene. What time are you going to bed? What are you doing in those couple hours before bed? Are you watching something stimulating? Are you on an electronic device? The light from the screens can stimulate the brain in such a way. Are we consider reading a book or listening to some quiet music, or are we meditating? Things that we can do to just kind of start to turn the brain off in the first place. Yeah, you may have heard me talk about mindfulness breathing, belly breathing, ways of just kind of shutting our brains down, stopping those racing thoughts from happening. That's one of them. Now, um, so I want to know, like, are they drinking something? I mean, people I find out thinking, oh yeah, they're drinking caffeine before bed. Not often, but we sometimes have that happen. So that's obviously from a sleep hygiene perspective. Is it dark enough in the room? Is there outdoor sounds? Would earplugs be helpful? Is there outdoor lighting? Can we get blacker shades, etc.? So all of those things to make the environment as conducive as possible. Now, there's also other things that people can take, and also this is actually part of that question. So, because the second part of this is, how safe is CBD oil for kids? If you had to choose between giving a preteen melatonin or CBD, which would you do? So CBD is absolutely what I would do first, from that perspective as opposed to hormone. Um, Obviously, we haven't had the ability to research CBD because of federal regulations. Obviously, it's now becoming more able to. Certainly, CBD in very high doses has now been FDA approved in a pharmaceutical called Epidiolex, which is clearly that they've studied incredibly high doses, higher than you would ever need for sleep, or quite frankly, almost anything. I've never used the doses that the FDA has said is safe to use in almost any patient for any reason. But CBD can be very helpful. Now, there's another minor cannabinoid that I personally has changed my life probably more than any other supplement, which is called CBN. Okay. And CBN is actually what THC becomes once it's no longer psychoactive and it changes to another chemical. And CBN, I started taking it myself about 15 months ago. I have tons of patients who are doing this now, falling asleep, but for me in particular, staying asleep, being able to sleep through the alarm, or if I do wake up once to go to the bathroom, to be able to fall back asleep as opposed to laying in bed for a few hours. And one of the things that CBD has also done for me is I found it also able to turn my brain off, because I wake up in the middle of the night and then I sit there looking at the clock and say, oh my god, I have 3 more hours before I have to wake up, and then I'm thinking about the hours and watching the clock turn on. So if you do have a clock in front of you, turn it away from you so you don't see those numbers. But also just being able to kind of sustain that sleep and have, I mean, I'm dreaming better. In the past last month, I slept once till 10:15 and once till 10:30 in the morning. I did not do this in college. I did not have the ability to do it. My wife actually both times came in to make sure I was breathing still, because she thought, "Oh my God, why is David still sleeping?" But this is an incredibly helpful thing. Sometimes in the THC world, of course, especially in kids, this is more further down the considerations, but indicas can be very helpful for that as well. Now, there are other things like amino acids. L-theanine is an amino acid derived from green tea, has calming effects. That's something that's very helpful. GABA, another amino acid that can be helpful as well. There's also other supplements as well that people are able to use that have calming effects as well. But if given the option, but at the end of the day, if nothing else is working and melatonin does, that's kind of a pretty good indicator for me that a person may actually have a melatonin deficiency, and then it's there and it fits it. So, at the end of the day, we all weigh the risks versus benefits of something. The importance of sleep is tantamount. If nothing's there, then obviously we are able to sleep. Nothing else. Our immune systems, our functional, cognitive functions. So we have to do what we have to do. Would I take melatonin over taking a Xanax every night? Yeah, for sure, I would do that. So again, it's all relative. Okay. Question from Tim. Oh, there was another one. Question from the same person, from George. What is the ideal range of vitamin D for immunity? So a level above 50 nanograms per deciliter per deciliter is the goal for immunity. In fact, I know that the laboratories say 30 to 100 is the reference range. 30 is the dose that you need for strong bones, for calcium absorption, mineralization of the bones. But 50 seems to be the key number for the immune system for general immunity. There was research back in the original summer of 2020, lots about that number of 50 being the key number in terms of severity relative to COVID. There were some really nice studies that came out then. People living in southern climates below certain, were actually, when they were outside more, higher vitamin D levels actually seemed to do better. There were some studies that showed that they seem to do better as well. Now, if I'm trying to support a person who has like an autoimmune condition or allergies, asthma, so whether it's a weaker immune system or an overreactive, like hyperinflammatory immune system, I'm aiming for 65, 70, 75. So it really depends on what we're doing. I know a lot of people say, oh, I'm taking 5,000 of vitamin D. That's great, right? I'm like, it's great if you have a good level. So to me, it took me 15,000 units a day to get my levels up and when I did, my allergies and asthma disappeared. Kid you not. I was on allergy medicines for over 30 years, figured this out. I actually knew I had an allergy to corn. So after I got my levels up, I said, okay, I'm going to try one piece of popcorn. And I took that and no reaction. And the next day I did two pieces and three pieces. And corn is one of the few grains and pseudograins that I have allowed myself to eat the past decade, just because I feel like I'm making up for lost time, but also the fact that my body can handle it. And it's something that I will allow myself as a treat. Okay. This is from Tim, longtime friend. Hi, Tim, if you're watching this. A friend of our practice. Amazing things that we've done with your son. It's wonderful, Michael. In one of your videos, I mentioned a 3CL protease inhibitor action of a couple of medications, and this is what Paxlovid, the medication that that Pfizer has released, for the antiviral that's becoming more available. That's an oral product that doesn't need to be given in hospitals. That was done, but Tim actually brought to my attention something called Tolovid, and I did again have to look this up, so I had some semblance of knowledge. So this is a botanical product. It's actually an extract from Gromwell root, and I'm going to attempt to pronounce this active ingredient. God help me. Lithospermium. So that's a word for you right there. Lithospermium erythrochizon extract. Erythromycin, sperm. Okay, all kinds of interesting things going on in those two words there, but it's grumble root, and that's what this product is. Now, they do have on their website a small study. I believe that there were 21 patients who were not given this, 11 patients who were. There were 0 deaths in the people who were given it, 5 deaths in the people who weren't given it. These weren't hospitalized people, so these were people who were sick or long. That's obviously one very small study. But it's the same mechanism of action, supposedly, as what Paxlovid does. And so I now know that they are in a phase 2 trial. And of course, hopefully would get to a phase 3 trial, which is the bigger types of studies that need to be done. But certainly, that's very promising that not only that there's other treatments out there that would have this type of protease inhibitor out there, but actually that it's a botanical. And so that's a really nice thing to be having. And if for those who don't know what a protease inhibitor is, it inhibits. So a protease breaks down proteins. When you hear the word ase, that usually means is what an enzyme, but this breaks down proteins. So what happens is when coronavirus is replicating inside the cell, okay, it makes so when the messenger RNA is then read as one long and made into a big protein, and then it needs to be chopped up into smaller pieces in order to make the actual virus. So if you can stop that chopping up of the genetic code, actually of the amino acids that are made from the genetic code from the messenger RNA, then you can effectively stop the virus from being able to replicate because it can't form. Brilliant science, right? I mean, how cool is that? And the really neat thing about this is the indicators are that it doesn't seem to be variant dependent, because it's actually not dealing with the actual antigen like the spike protein that our antibodies or the vaccine has been made for, but this is going right to the heart of the beast, stopping it right there. So I do look forward to having to seeing if more comes out of this. This would be very exciting because, of course, I always prefer to have things that are nutraceutical as opposed to pharmaceutical. Of course, more importantly, we need to keep people healthy. Certainly, at this point in time, I would have no problem writing for Paxlovid for people if they were interested. Okay. Um, Also, Tim did, because this is just the good person that Tim is. He actually gave me a disclosure that he did not have any stock in the company, but that he did buy the product. Didn't know whether he didn't feel any side effects, but didn't know whether it was working either. So thank you for that disclaimer. I'm glad that you weren't a shill for the company there. So that's great. Okay, next question is from Martha. If an older person or elderly person who's fully vaccinated for COVID and boosted then gets COVID, whether they do or don't have symptoms, should they still try to get monoclonal antibodies? So first of all, the get monoclonal antibodies is a tough thing now because, as you may know, most of the monoclonal antibodies that were working for previous variants don't work for Omicron. There is one available, limited supply. Now, if somebody was asymptomatic, no, I don't think that a person needs to be doing something if they're asymptomatic. If they have the slightest of sniffles, maybe not. But if things were really starting to, not even really, just starting to kind of escalate, and it was available, I absolutely would. But in all honesty, would I choose Paxlovid if given those two as a binary choice? I would. Of course, want to put a plug in for our immune protocol. As many of you know, we put into our Patreon account for extra information there. We have on some of the videos that I've made throughout the past year, we've put as well as on our patient portal for those who are patients of ours. We've put our COVID prevention and treatment protocol, all the natural things that we recommend. There's a pretty, what to do at the beginning of COVID, what to do if you start to get into that cytokine secondary phase, a cytokine storm secondary phase. So, of course, treating this nutraceutically, treating this preventively, proactively, in my experience, has been a really helpful thing throughout the entire pandemic. The latest numbers that I had when I solicited my also my other providers is I think 3 or 4 total people have been put into the hospital through the entire. Nobody ICU, not a single death, thank God. Um, Half of them, or I think 3 of them, were young children, like infants, like even like couple month old, and it was more just for observation, make sure everything was okay. Kids did fine. There was one older woman who did have some more problems that did need some hospitalization, but again, nothing of the ventilator, ECMO, really dangerous types of stuff. So whether that's because we all as a community have good vitamin D levels and zinc levels, and we start the high dose vitamin A, which, as you know, is my favorite thing to do on the first sign of illness. Whether we're living healthier, cleaner lifestyles, all of those things are obviously variables that most people in this country and the world don't do. But, every time that there's been a new infectious disease, same thing that happened when the swine flu came out about a decade ago. And I would be hearing from my pediatric colleagues, oh my God, this is so terrible. We're seeing 10 to 15 sick kids in the office a day. We're putting 4 to 5 people in the hospital per week. And I'm like, really? Because I think we only had one person that was sick enough to come into the office in the first place. Everybody called. We gave the immune protocol, and it never advanced to anybody. So, same thing with like rotavirus, the common gut bug that many young children get. I'll hear from a colleague, oh, rotavirus is so bad. And I'm like, oh, is rotavirus going around? I didn't even know about it because, again, we don't hear about it. Long-term breastfeeding, all of those types of things, which is, the youngest children are the ones who are most impacted by it. But, it's also nicely that it's just treated with saline if you had to. But yeah, we just don't see this as a major problem. It's a stomach bug. And so, again, because of what we're doing, we do make those differences. So I always want to put a plug in for our natural remedies. What about young vaccinated children who get COVID and develop symptoms beyond a mild cold? So I guess it would depend to me, but how mild of a cold are we talking about? Certainly anything coming up. If there was widely available monoclonal antibodies, like we did have it with the Regeneron last summer, etc. At that point when it was widely available here in Florida, I personally thought the risk versus benefit. I think it's a very safe type of treatment. There have been occasional allergic reactions to it. But again, in my experience, we don't really expand to that secondary phase with any reason to it. So yeah, so obviously it's going to be a case by case basis. If it was a healthy person versus a person with immunodeficiency, a special needs kid, we have seen pandas. I guess this would be pans trigger by COVID. Very coincidentally, haven't seen that happen from the vaccine, which is kind of, we didn't really know how that was going to play out, but we really haven't seen that in talking to colleagues who do biomedical autism work around the country. It's the same thing. We are seeing, we've seen triggers from that. Now, I'm sure there are people out there that have heard people, but just I haven't seen it. Okay. Now, what is the latest thinking of long COVID? God, I wish I knew more. This is so not yet well understood. Okay, because we know that there are people who have low COVID who had most minimal of symptoms, or even some people asymptomatic, and long COVID where there are symptoms that persist way after the virus is cleared from the body, way after that initial cytokine storm was there, and so I actually look as long COVID as kind of a form of PANS, right? That post-inflammatory, post-infectious syndrome. And so that's where we're constantly focusing on all of the things that we do to try to support the immune system and keep it from overreacting. So when we're talking about high dose omega-3 fatty acids, curcumin, the activated curcumin that we use, again, making sure vitamin D and zinc levels are good, giving glutathione to people. Those are, again, things that we are focusing on for the people who have long COVID as well. But, thankfully in our practice, we've seen some, but again, we haven't seen that much of it either. Okay. Next question from Nicholas. What does endemic mean and how is it different from a pandemic? So, pandemic by definition means it's around the world all at the same time. And so so while people have talked about, and actually I did make a video that we're going to be releasing, I think it's tomorrow, on this that goes into a little more detail as well, but of course I'll share it with you here. So we are still in a pandemic, okay? Because there is still coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, everywhere in the world. So by that definition, we are in a pandemic. Now we are in the waning stages of the pandemic. Now, endemic really means that it usually becomes seasonal, but it means that there's always some of it around. It'll come back again. So, this isn't like full elimination like we've almost seen with polio. This is a more of a situation where people are still able to get it. But again, because of immunity, now, because of wild immunity, we know how wonderful that is in terms of giving people immunity to to people who've chosen to be vaccinated, the added antibodies from that. People who have had exposure to spike protein more than once, and it seems as if people who have been exposed 3 times seems to actually be a kind of a magical number, whether that's a combination of wild disease, whether that's who people choose to vaccinate, but that multiple exposure, just like kids vaccines, there's a reason why the tetanus shot is given at 2 months, 4 months, and 6 months, because you have to have that repeated exposure to have that long-term memory. But now we're in this community immunity, herd immunity stage, and of course, there's a reason why percent positivity, which was at 31% in Hillsborough County about a month ago, 6 weeks ago, is down. I looked just now; it's at 7%. Huge. That's a huge, huge drop. So of course, that means more people are immune. It's not being spread anymore. Okay. And so we're not in the endemic stage, but I do think that it's very possible that by the time we get through the spring, I expect that we will see the same kind of low light that we saw last year. And, obviously, so one of the interesting things we'll see is, do we get another spike in the summertime or when kids come back to school in the fall? What happens? It gets next cold and flu season. So again, I think over the course of the next year, we will have a pretty good understanding to answer that, like, where are we really at in terms of the longevity of this? Okay. So, how is Florida doing best compared to the rest of the country? So, as you may know, and this was specifically for masks, but certainly it's just a good indicator of what's happening in the community as a whole. When the CDC came out with its new guidelines saying that when there is people who are in a low risk community county, which means that the overall caseload is less than 200 per 100,000 people in that community. Hillsborough, I think it was just 22 just now, which is again why I'm expecting us to be dropped in Hillsborough County, as well as how many beds are, how many cases are in the hospital and how many active beds in the hospital that can be staffed are filled with COVID. That's what makes it a high, medium, or low risk community. Okay, so we are still, as a whole, in this part of in Hillsborough County, I'm actually down in South Florida. In South Florida, it's actually down in the green. It's actually in the low now. So again, every county, so it's community by community. But there certainly are states, like we're all over, like up in the Northeast, where we've heard where, especially some of the more stringent, shall we say, vaccine and mask measurements were put into place. That they're all laxing now because they are seeing that type of community decrease. Are there any more variants on the horizon? My crystal ball broke, unfortunately, so I can't make that type of prediction. We shall see how that will come. Now, I do see that a couple questions did come in here. Um, I'm sorry, I'm looking over there because it's on my screen on the big screen over there. I'm using my phone over here. Um, what do you recommend for the sulfur? For kids that suffer from acid reflux? Um, Diet can be an issue, can be something. One of the things that we have found the most successful is a modified form of licorice root called DGL, deglycyrrhizide licorice. It helps coat the esophagus. And it keeps down something that can be safe long term. I know a lot of people will use antacids or H2 blockers like the Pepcid Zantac or the proton pump inhibitors, the Previcids, etc. And people say those long terms, and I've seen doctors order it long term. if you look at the package labels, those were never intended to be used for more than 12 weeks. So obviously, we are looking for things that can be used long term. There's a medication also called Carafate that can be very helpful as well, because all it does is just coat the thing. But again, coming back to the why is it happening? Why is it not happening to the next person? That's super duper important that we want to try to figure that out as well. So again, coming back biomedically, what kind of foods are we doing? Stress, we know that can make an issue as well. So that's kind of how we look at that. I think I had one more question, and this comes from Mary. Again, pardon you, my close up of my chin here. What research and practices do you what research and practice do you maintain early on that may be so? I'm sorry, hey Kevin. Actually, that scrolls off my page. Kevin, who's our show producer, says that. Kevin, can you please read that question to me, because I can't make it out with the lighting that's in my eyes.
I can. Hopefully, everybody can hear me. On this question, it says, what research and practices did you, Dr. David, embrace early on that may have seemed like it was coming out of left field, which now has proven to be solid and beneficial to patients, especially the special needs population?
Sure. Well, the yeast and the dietary stuff, which obviously still hasn't caught on in the mainstream world. First patient came to me, my very first patient with autism said to me, "Hey, I've been hearing about this, that some kids have yeast. You treat the yeast, their autism gets better. Would you run this test for me?" And I'm like, "It's out of pocket. You want to pay for that? Why would I have a problem ordering a test for you? Let's wait. I've certainly used antifungals for other reasons." And of course, when I gave it to this child and beautiful things happened, like I was talking about before, that's something that came in. I do not know why the gastrointestinal world and why the rest of the world is not seeing the importance of Candida yeast. Overall, we know about the importance of the microbiome. That itself, has something, giving probiotics and eat your colder foods. That was a kind of a foofy type of thing, right? But now that is a clear part of traditional medicine now, or at least people who have done their homework. Obviously, some doctors are set in their old ways, but that's certainly something there. But I would say probably the most important thing that I was looked at crazy that is so mainstream now is the vitamin D story. Again, I know people, not everybody's testing for it, which is so easily done. But when you talk about vitamin D to most providers, it's not an out of left field type of thing. Okay, so that probably would be the one thing that I would say the most, but also, advocating for an elimination diet. Okay, I know people do allergy food testing and stuff like that. We use an elimination diet where there's a list of foods that are the most common foods that people react to, as well as to the as well as a list of foods that they may be reacting to, and eliminating all them once and bringing them back one at a time to see what trigger. Now, that's obviously something that's not always done, but how could that be not more proof than any kind of test or anything else like that? So, but elimination nation diets, and we're hearing about them more and more. That's being used too. So that was also something that I was an early adapter on. Kevin, was there any other questions?
Yeah, we have an additional one from John that says, if I got COVID recently, do I need the booster?
Okay. Well, need is a relative term. Okay. So, it's not impossible. There are people who are actually getting BA2, which is the second Omicron coming, if you will, who had gotten, they're very, very rare. And certainly if a person had Delta or previous, there's not protection there. But again, you could think of it this way. Just the more times a person has been exposed to spike protein, whether it was artificially made or naturally made, the more antibodies they're going to have, the more that their B cells and their T cells, that memory, that to be able to jump into action is going to happen. So if somebody just flat out said to me, do I think that a person who's had COVID, who also has been vaccinated, will probably be in a better place in terms of catching it again? Probably. Now, it's interesting though, because we are also seeing that the vaccine is wearing off, right? And interestingly, we're seeing the booster wearing off sooner than even dose number 2 or dose number 1. Dose number 1 seemed to actually last the protection for that ended up lasting the longest. So again, but as you may have seen from a previous video that I'm in, I also have looked at Omicron as a booster, right? So if a person had COVID earlier on and then got COVID as Omicron, they were just boosted. If a person had the vaccine before and now they had Omicron, now they've been boosted. So we don't actually know for sure, and I'll see some studies that show me that Omicron and COVID protection, which does last longer. There's studies that are showing that the protection is lasting. The antibodies are longer than a year, but the studies that I've seen is in mix. Some studies have even shown that the wild disease is better than the vaccine overall, regardless of how many doses a person gets. Other not. So that's kind of that too.
Awesome. We have
Okay.
another question from Carrie. Can you
Yeah.
talk about the importance of medical cannabis for anxiety?
Yes. Okay. So as you may know, I use many different types of cannabinoids. CBD was always my mainstay first go to. You may have heard me more recently talk about CBG, another cannabinoid, but there's no doubt that many people who use medical cannabis of the THC variety massively helps their anxiety, depression. Number one side effect that I see in those patients is reduction or elimination of their anxiety or depression medications, which is a nice side effect. But clearly, this is something that can be very helpful as well. And certainly that's a diagnosis that qualifies people in the state of Florida. So certainly anybody wishing to explore that, of course, over on our holistic relief side, we can take care of that.
Awesome. And then, David, we have another question from Bob, and it says, David, what do you love to do for fun in your life?
So I would certainly say music is a big part of it, whether it's playing, seeing live music. You'll find me at Skipper's Smokehouse, where I met my wife on Grateful Dead night on Thursday nights. But the live musical experience, the musical festivals, which again I wasn't able to do for a couple of years. I'm looking forward to getting more back into that. Movies. Love going to see movies. It's a family event. We try to see a movie whenever we possibly can. Big fans of the Star Wars series, of the Marvel series. Huge there. And Benjamin and I, we are sports freaks. Naomi has come along for that too. So my wife sits and does anything else but that in our family. But if there's a ball involved, if there's scoring involved, we're pretty much there. We've become big freaks of curling. We started watching the Olympics 12 years ago, I think it was, and it's just a fascinating sport. I mean, I know most people don't like to watch it. We just sit there and watch curling matches. But any kind of sports where there's numbers involved, the Olympics. Benjamin and I have on our bucket list to actually get to Olympics. Maybe the Olympics that I think are in 6 years that are going to be in Los Angeles. Boy, we would love to get out for that. But that's kind of where our most of stuff is. But also just hanging out with the family, having fun, going to Disney World. Big fans of Disney World. I have my issues with a lot of corporate America. Disney World's one that gets a pass from me because I've seen so much of what they've done for the special needs community and accommodations, etc. So yeah, that's how I spend my time.
Love it, David. That is all of our questions for.
All right. Well, wow, that was fun. Yeah, so we are looking to do this monthly. We as you know, with our Patreons, we hopefully as we get more and more questions, one of the things that we will be doing is we'll be prioritizing people who are patrons of us or Patreons of us on our Patreon page. So as we get bigger, that would be another incentive maybe for some people to join there. But of course, we are putting additional content there. I'm putting music up there that we haven't released to YouTube, etc. So check us out there as well. So, wow, that was fun. So we're going to be doing this once a month, as long as you put up with me, as long as people log in. So tell your friends, tell your family, tell everybody to come along next month. We will be putting out again, we'll put out another reminder before we do it. But thank you so much for everybody who's stuck around, anybody who's joined in late. We will be posting this originally, so you can share it with other people as well. And then for that, it'll be more of a regular Ask Dr. David because it will be not live. So you guys got the live part. All right. Well, I hope everybody has a great day. Have a great upcoming weekend. Say your prayers for my mom and dad. They're doing great, but we'll say prayers for everybody. Say our prayers for the people of Ukraine also. On a serious moment, we obviously have all been witnessing what's going on there and just the collective pain and sorrow that we are all seeing right now. Gosh, did we really think that this could happen these days? I didn't, but what do I know about geopolitics? But anyways, just did want to put a shout out and an energy, just send that healing energy to the people over there because they didn't sign up for this. And with hitting civilian targets, schools being hit today, it's a tragedy among tragedies. And so sorry to end on a down note there, but I think it was warranted there. So again, send their good mojo that way too. Have a good night, everybody.